too. Adventures waiting just for you.
Good morning and happy Thursday. For those of you that are new, welcome. And for those of you that are returning, welcome back to the Torque and Thrust Talk Show, episode number 43, Captain Jack Frost. My name is Bill. I am a captain on the Boeing 737 for a major U.S. airline. And today we're going to be talking about a couple different things. First of all, we're going to talk about our weekly debrief, or my weekly debrief. I'll talk about the winter weather flying I just did this past week through the major winter storm that was affecting the entire middle of the United States. And then today's discussion topic, we are going to talk a little bit more about airline winter operations and what you can expect as a passenger while taxiing out. Now, normally in the show, this is where I would introduce my fellow co-founder of the Three Green Simulations Group, flight sim extraordinaire, and retired New York City EMT, Tommy D of Level Flight Simulations. Unfortunately, he didn't make it to pre-show. I can only assume he's probably sleeping. Tommy does work late night shifts, so the equivalent of my red eyes. So it's sometimes he doesn't wake up in time for the show. Perfectly okay. All we're gonna do today is we're gonna basically turn it into a Bill's Corner, I guess, episode where it's just gonna be me. Sorry, I know a lot of you are here for Tommy D. Tommy D offers a lot of entertainment value to this channel because he does a lot of great stuff on YouTube and Twitch with his Microsoft Flight Sim and other gaming that he does. But today, unfortunately, you're stuck with the old Captain Bill. So first thing we're gonna talk about before the update is the news. There really isn't much of an update. There's a couple things. I'm going to talk about UPS 2976 for a second. There was a small update, not a major one. We kind of touched on it last week where we were discussing the photos that came out. So we'll talk about that slightly. And then we'll briefly touch on, as part of the debrief, but the Endeavor CRJ that slid off the runway in Des Moines because it actually affected me, as a matter of fact, for this past trip. So, but before I get, on a rambling mess here, let's stay organized, and we'll first start off with the UPS 2976. So we did talk about this last week. I didn't bring it up because it had just come out the morning of the podcast last Wednesday, the week before. This is the newly released CCTV still frames of UPS 2976 out of Louisville. This is directly from the NTSB website. This is not pulled from anything else. This is directly from the fact finders. Other than that, there still hasn't been an update. The most recent update still remains November 7th, which is the one that I briefed last week, or the week before. So to go back to the last episode if you want to hear the most recent update, or before that, and that's the most recent one. But what we will talk about, once again, trying to remain as factual as possible. I do not speculate. I am not an MD-11 pilot. I am a airline pilot for almost 10 years now, and a captain on the 737. So I'm going to keep it as general as possible. It's numbered in order. So the tops are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, going horizontally and stepping down. So it looks like in the photo, obviously, one, they're at rotate. Okay, so rotation, for those of you that don't know, rotation is what we refer to when we pull the nose off the ground, because we're rotating. If you looked at it from the side angle of an airplane, we're rotating it off the ground. So the nose wheels coming up is after rotate. Now, in an airline or transport category aircraft scenario, we have a couple call outs on the 737. Check thrust set. So we're checking that takeoff thrust has been set. At 100 knots, we announce 100 knots because that's what we enter what we call the high speed regime. So up to 100 knots, at least at my company, we reject for basically anything with the exception of like doors. Basically, the first officer, whoever is not flying, will call out what the caution light is or something that pops up, and the captain makes the consideration whether or not to reject or continue. At the regionals, it was anything below, or in our low speed regime, we reject. Not so much at my company. It's announce it, and the captain will make the clear announcement, either continue or reject. Each captain has their own preference. For example, I'm not stopping for a doors light because a lot of times that's a seal issue and usually disappears once we're airborne. I've actually, as an FO, had a door light coming out of LA rolling down right before 100 knots. No biggie. Captain said continue. As soon as we went airborne, aircraft started pressurizing. No issue. But there's other things that, like anything engine. Hydraulic is kind of an interesting one. We might get a flight control light, which is right in front of the captain on the 737. That is up for discussion. I've heard multiple things. Can you go flying with a hydraulic issue? Yeah, you have manual reversion. You have manual cables on the 737. However, it's one of those things is, do I want to take it into the air with manual reversion? It is a very physically demanding thing that we practice in the simulator. So do I want to take it, or do I have enough room to stop? Conversely, if it is a hydraulic fluid issue, do I still have enough room to stop without maximum braking, or you only have a maximum of 6 braking applications with the backup hydraulic accumulator? So, little things like that. So prior to 100 knots, announce what you call, we're going to make, or the captain's going to either clearly state continue or reject. After 100 knots, in the smaller jets, some of it's 80 knots, but for us in 100 knots, we're considered in the high speed regime. So in that regime, we only reject for any fire. So any fire bell, anything like that, we'll reject for. Engine failure, if we get an engine failure in that phase before 100 knots and before our go speed or V1 speed. If the aircraft's unsafe to fly, whether it's perceived, we hear a loud bang, there's a lot of shaking, there's veer, air traffic control tells us to stop the takeoff roll, or we get an indication of the red guard, or well, they're not called guard lights, but they're runway status lights. If they turn on red, letting us know someone's crossing downfield or landing on an intersecting runway, we have to reject. Or predictive wind shear. So predictive wind shear on the 737 and most fleets is a computer system that couples with the weather radar in order to predict possibility of wind shear. We can reject for wind shear because of how dangerous it is. We can reject for wind shear all the way up to V1, which is our decision speed. Now at V1, dependent on your definition, there's different ones, but basically V1 is our decision speed. Anything we can reject safely or stop the takeoff roll up to V1. That's saying at V1, with us stopping the airplane, we will have enough runway to safely stop with aircraft performance, or a maximum effort rejected takeoff. After V1, we have to fly the airplane. It doesn't matter if the aircraft's on fire, like in this case, lost an engine. I'll go over that here in a second. You have to fly. You do not have enough runway to safely stop. Right, so you have to take it airborne. That's part of it. That's something that we train for, and we have to. It's the safest, at that point, the safest option is try to get the aircraft airborne and off the ground. So, with that being said, let's review that. Check thrust set, prior to 100 knots, call out what you see. The captain will make the determination whether we continue or reject. After 100 knots, we only reject for engine failure, aircraft, any fire, aircraft unsafe to fly, predicted wind shear. This is on the 737, mind you. I don't know what it is on the MD-11. I'm just kind of giving you a framework for what I'm going to be talking about. And then after V1, we're going to take it airborne. Okay? That's my briefing that I give my first officers every trip. That is the criteria that we all give our first officers at my airline for rejected takeoff criteria. Now, for this picture, and remember these things, right? So V1 is decision speed. Rotate always comes after V1. At no point would we be rotating and then reject and have to slam the nose wheel back down and reject. It's always V1, rotate. Sometimes V1 and rotate are the same airspeed. If it's a wet runway like on the 737, sometimes there's like a 10 to 15 knot delay. So it's V1, rotate. Rotate always comes after V1. Keep that in mind, right? So in picture number 1 here of UPS 2976, you can see that the nose wheel and nose have been lifted off the ground. It is safe to assume, as an airline pilot, I can make the safe assumption without speculation that this aircraft is indeed rotating. The nose doesn't just naturally come off the runway like that. It has to be inputted from the pilots. So from that logic, right, I'm trying to explain this to you understand that this is factual, not speculation. I can say confidently that they were beyond their V1 speed, right? Because what I just said, it's V1, rotate. Never is it ever going to be rotate V1. Never. So the fact that they're rotating indicates that they had made it to their V1 rotate, or their decision speed, without any issues. Or any reason to reject, I should say. Any reason to reject. I believe the NTSB report did say that there was a bell, I think, at 37 seconds in. Time to V1 varies across aircraft. It depends on how heavy you are. Acceleration characteristics depending on the runway and contamination, etc. Like in winter weather, in a contaminated runway with snow and stuff, it'll take a lot longer to accelerate to V1, just like if you're heavier. If you're a lighter aircraft on a dry runway, you may accelerate to V1 a lot quicker. So that 37 seconds, not sure yet until we get more data and the cockpit voice recorder transcripts. But so all we can tell off this picture is picture number 1 still frame is that they were at rotate, which means we can assume they got to V1 without rejecting. And that at that point, it appears in the picture, the number one, that the engine had not detached from the wing yet. Everything looks normal by the time they got to the rotate call. Picture number two, I this is unnerving. I hate looking at these pictures. But you can see the left engine, that's the one closest to us, the number one engine, appearing to detach from the wing. The angle that it currently is at in picture number two is not normal. You can see engine number three, which is on the right side, because remember, it's one on the left side. I think it's two in the tail from the MD-11 is what they call it, and number three is on the right side. Number three is attached normally. Compare it to the left side in picture two, and you can see that engine is separating up, and that's pretty because as you're rotating off the ground, that airflow is still coming straight at the airplane. It's called relative wind. So it's starting to separate. Now, picture number three, the engine has completely separated from the aircraft, and you can see flames starting to erupt from, I can't really tell from this picture if it's it's a combination of the wing and also maybe the fuel, because what's happening right there is there's fuel going to the engine. So the separation it would make sense that there was fuel igniting, because there's hot gases and fire basically and sparks going on in that engine as it rips from the wing. Picture number four is clear separation of the engine. It looks like it's going up and over the backside of the aircraft. Clearly the left wing is intact for now and is just fully engulfed in flames. Like I said, probably from the fuel that was being ignited during the combustion cycle. Number five shows the airplane becoming airborne, which once again, as I mentioned before, after V1, you're committed to taking the aircraft airborne. So that's what they're doing. They're getting the aircraft airborne. And then number six is the last one. You can see them airborne with a little left roll, which is associated during, if you lose that engine, you have I guess a left banking tendency because your right engine is still operating and still attached to the aircraft. So that would be expected as they're trying to get off the ground. I hate seeing these pictures because in number six, they're fighting for their lives. Not to be morbid, but those are my fellow pilots. Those are fellow professionals. And I can imagine what they were going through in that moment, fighting, because at that point they don't have a choice. They have to take it airborne, whether the airplane's in one piece or not. And in a big jet like that, even in the 737 on like the 900ER, I can't see my engine. I can barely see the wingtip because it's such a big airplane. So I don't know. They may not have known that their engine separated and we're just treating it like an engine failure, which is exactly what they were supposed to do. So yeah, it's hard to see these pictures, but it's important that we go through them so everybody understands where we're going in terms of the latest update with the UPS 2976. Now, the rest is coming. It's going to take months. It's going to take years. PSA, the accident that happened back in January is still an open investigation. They do have initial reports on that, so it will take time because the NTSB is doing everything they can to properly investigate this. A couple episodes ago, I did talk about the similarities between 191, American 191, which happened, I believe, back in the 1980s out of Chicago O'Hare, and 2976. They were both DC-10/MD-11 aircraft. So there are some similarities, and unfortunately, there are pictures of American 19. They're famous pictures of the American flight coming out of 191, coming out of Chicago too. Very similar. So, but that's the latest update for the NTSB briefing or update for UPS 2976. And obviously, as they come along, I will offer more updates, etc. So now let's move on to my weekly debrief. So those of you that live in the Midwest in the United States probably know we had and it's still happening actually as we're speaking. It's moving more towards the East Coast, but the Midwest got nailed with a winter storm. And I will say in my 10 years of flying as an airline pilot, this is one of the worst winter storms I have seen. I'll talk about Endeavor 5087 here in a second. That kind of ties into what my debrief is. for this week, the things that went well is we were safe. That was the key thing, is safety. I got home safely, got my passengers where they're going safely, and mitigated a ton of threats, which I'll kind of go over as we're working our way through this week. So my week started off with trying to commute to work, which for those of you who don't know, I don't live in Chicago. I'm a Chicago-based pilot, but I live in the Midwest. One of the benefits of being an airline pilot is you can choose where you live as long as you have access to airline flights to your base. So I have direct flights from where I live to Chicago. On a good day, it's like 6 to 8 flights, depending on the time of year. Um, and because I knew there was weather coming in, I gave myself 3 flights, plus my current contract, since I upgraded. Well, now it's done, but when I started this trip, I was still a positive space, which means that my company bought me a ticket in the back of an airplane versus having to travel on standby. But I still gave myself 3 shots to get to O'Hare to start my trip this week. Showing up, the first morning flight of the day canceled. And then my third option canceled almost simultaneously because of the weather in Chicago. So now I was down to 2 options in the middle of the day. One was on United Express and one was on Envoy, American Eagle. We get on. I was lucky enough to catch the captain while we're going through security of my first option, and him and I were talking. And we said, I was like, "Hey, how's it looking at O'Hare? Any ground stops? Any delays we got to worry about?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know. Right now we're looking good." So I was like, "Cool." So we get on board, and then sure enough, we get nailed with like a 4-hour edict, which is an expect departure clearance time. It's a takeoff time for traffic management into O'Hare. So we deplane, and that captain did a great job. Jordan at GoJet, phenomenal job. Made face-to-face PAs regularly, kept the passengers informed of what was going on, and made sure we knew the plan and everything that was going on and why the delays were happening. Outstanding job. And I would love to say that is a common thing I see when I'm commuting on the regionals. However, it's not. GoJet tends to be the best at it. But Captain Jordan, you did a phenomenal job. Went above and beyond to make sure the passengers knew what was going on. So I thoroughly appreciate that, especially as a passenger on that flight. Now, I walked over to Envoy and got checked in for the jump seat on that one because for some reason their edict, even though it was a later flight than us, they held onto their edict earlier than GoJet. GoJet kept sliding backwards. And the only thing I could possibly think of that was causing that is United Airlines has such a presence in Chicago in terms of flight slots and arrivals and departures that they were more proportionally affected by the delay program because of that than American. Because American, it's an ongoing thing where American is shrinking in Chicago because United is dominating in terms of arrivals and departures. So that's all I could think of. But I'm really glad that I did choose to go on Envoy because while we left late, we still got there with enough time for me to go and try to take my first flight, which was getting delayed throughout the day because my aircraft was coming in from somewhere else, so on and so forth, the domino effect. And I was lucky because that GoJet flight pushed off the gate shortly after us, but I checked when I got into O'Hare, it actually returned back to the gate and I think canceled or rescheduled until the next morning. So a sheer dumb luck on my part that I picked, Envoy to get on versus GoJet. But then I get into O'Hare and it's just rolling delays. I've had this happen before. It's my airplane has to come in. I think it was from Vegas is where it was coming in from, but they were part of that ground delay program as well. So we're waiting for them. It's constantly, I think we started showing at 1:10 was our show, which is where our duty period starts on day one. Even though I was commuting still at that time, because of all the delays, I'm still technically on duty per the FAA. So that starts becoming a problem because they keep rolling our delays back, our departure time back. Initially we're supposed to be going to Chicago or Orlando, and then to Dulles, and then to Bradley, Hartford, Connecticut for the night. But then they pushed our Orlando departure all the way back to 11 p.m., which exceeded the time that we had to take off in order to be legal for flight duty rest period, which that was like clear cut, like we're not going. So I called scheduling. This was about 6 hours prior. I called scheduling because I'm trying to give them a heads up as early as I can to be like, hey, you guys are going to need to recrew this flight. So I told them, hey, I noticed the departure got pushed beyond our crew critical off time for our duty period. I just wanted to give you a heads up because that we're not going to be legal for that flight. And scheduling asks, are you guys going to extend? Because we can extend up to 2 hours at pilot's discretion. We don't have to accept it, but we can. And my rule of thumb is that is when, and according to the FAA, is when you show up to work at report time, you're supposed to be rested for the scheduled duty period. So for me, anything beyond the duty period, I can't guarantee my fitness for duty because I came rested, prepared for my duty period, which I was supposed to be done at midnight, and now they were going to have us launching at 11 p.m. at night. So I, respectfully told the controller or the crew scheduler, I said, no, we're not planning on extending because it's 6 hours away, and I can't guarantee our fitness for duty. And he goes, okay, that's fair. Now I got to figure out what we're going to do with your flight. So I'll call you back if there's any changes, but just keep an eye on your schedule. I said, okay, cool. About 3 hours later, they had us, they kept changing the schedule to try to figure out what they were going to do with us. At one point I was double deadheading or triple deadheading. They wanted me to deadhead down to Orlando, then deadhead to Dulles, then deadhead to Bradley to be in position. But for some reason in Dulles, they had me landing 2.5 hours and trying to take the deadhead 2.5 hours earlier to Bradley, which wasn't going to work. So eventually they ended up pulling us off that flight, and we ended up overnighting 12 hours in O'Hare, which is unique, especially as a commuter, because they don't initially offer you hotels because we're Chicago based. They assume we live there. So I called them and said, hey, I'm not a commuter. I'm sorry, I don't live in Chicago. So can I get a hotel? And they're like, yeah, sure, we'll put you up. So that's what we did. We stayed in Chicago for 12 hours. Then the next day we woke up and they changed our schedule, and we were just supposed to do a Des Moines turn and then do like a 24-hour overnight in Chicago again. Not a bad schedule. The only problem is I woke up on my news feed on my social media. I saw that Endeavor 5087 had slid off the runway in Des Moines, Iowa the night prior, 10:30 p.m. And unfortunately, that was the airport I had to do my turn out of for that morning. So I immediately called the dispatcher and I said, hey, just as a heads up, I don't know if you're aware because you're probably not working on our flight plan yet, but Des Moines Airport had an airplane, an RJ, go off the end of the runway last night. Everybody's okay, according to the news, but that's going to affect our departure time because I'm pretty sure the airport's still closed. Mainly because they have to, before they move an airplane like that, and in an incident like that, they have to get NTSB approval to move the airplane first. And then once they get approval, they actually have to orchestrate in winter weather, pulling the CRJ, a 35-ton airplane, out of the snowbank where it ended up in and back onto the taxiway. So we were supposed to depart I think at 9 a.m. and the airport was going to be NOTAM closed until at least, I think, 2:30 p.m. Central Time. And unfortunately, both runways were closed. One was for weather, one was for the obvious incident with Endeavor 5087. So we sat for a while, and at one point they did start opening up the airport with an hour prior permission. But after discussing with my dispatcher, they still had the runways NOTAM closed. So we didn't feel comfortable releasing to an airport that we weren't guaranteed to have an open runway. So once that was a couple hours. I think we were delayed like 5 hours getting out to Des Moines. Once that opened up, we were released and going. And that was another thing. It was because of the weather, and the contaminated runway, which means runways with like snow, ice, and stuff on it. My first officer and I discussed and agreed that I would be doing the flying that day just to mitigate any threats. It's easier to do it that way. So I flew both legs. Going to Des Moines, we landed. It was we did a short field contaminated runway landing, which was as my discretion. I said we were going to do that. I'm glad I did because the braking action or the ability of the aircraft to brake on runway 23 was definitely about medium. We go from a scale of like 0 to 5 or 6, 6 being a dry runway, it's fine. 5 being like a wet runway, and then like 3 or 4 just means that you're not braking as effectively as you would on a dry runway. So needless to say, that was definitely a slick runway. And as we were turning off, the taxiways were a little bit worse. So I taxied in at a snail's pace. The passengers could have probably walked quicker to the terminal than I was taxiing, but I didn't want to slip and slide, especially because Endeavor just slid off the night before. And in those conditions, a lot of people, like a passenger came up to me and was like, "Oh, was it the pilot's fault?" And I was like, "We don't know. That's what the NTSB, the NTSB doesn't assign blame. They're there to investigate and offer recommendations. So we have to wait and see what happened." But after taxiing through that, I highly doubt that the pilots were at fault, because there was just patches of taxiways that were slick. They could have been going as slow as they possibly could, but when there's zero braking action at the end of a runway and the wind was howling too, it was gusting. They probably didn't. They just couldn't control the airplane, because once you're on it, and that's when is when you go to brake. There's no other indication other when you go to brake and you're not braking, you're not stopping. So I'm just glad everybody's safe. I'm glad the Endeavor crew is safe. But it was just an unfortunate incident that affected my day. So then we're parked at now in Des Moines, and Des Moines is a third-party contractor service for my company in terms of ground handling, and they were doing a great job. Those, bless their souls, they were out there shoveling snow. I watched them have to shovel multiple carts and tugs out because it was actively snowing while we were there. And so we took a delay, but they were really hard to get a hold of on the radio because everybody was outside working. So it's kind of what we call a skeleton crew that was working. So we were delayed because they had to clear the carts. They had to get the bags on board. We finally pushed. And then O'Hare went into ground stop again for runway clearing and stuff like that for the ice and snow. By the time we got out to the runway, it was lifted. There was a slight delay for our final weights, which is our weights, right? But we double check before we take off. We push off the gate without them and then usually get them on the way out to the runway. Took off, went to O'Hare, landed without issue. However, there was a huge traffic jam in O'Hare. It took us about 2 hours from landing to get to our gate. And the most frustrating part, and I don't know if this was like a winter operations breakdown in O'Hare, I was actually thoroughly surprised. I'm extremely thankful that the teams were there and working as hard as they were, the snow clearing team and air traffic control, but was thoroughly surprised at the misconnect between, like, for example, we got turned onto a taxiway by air traffic control last minute, and we turned, and then suddenly, like, we're getting ready to cross the runway, so I turned on all our landing lights and stuff, and I noticed that past the whole short line, there's a ton of snow, and what it is the snow blowers were blowing all the snow off the runway, keeping the runways immaculate. O'Hare's runways were amazing, but the taxiways were getting all this snow that was freezing over. So I'm slowly taxiing through probably about, I would say probably a good like quarter inch of snow, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you can feel it in the airplane, especially because the wheels don't have any drivetrain or transmission. It's the thrust that's pushing us through that stuff. Multiple taxiways that had poor braking action that I took super slow. And then at some point, the east side of the airport completely iced up. So then they had all the traffic shift to the west side where I was, which was both de-icing traffic, departure traffic, and arriving traffic, which normally O'Hare runs them opposite, so it's constantly flowing. So now we have this huge traffic jam. Well, the other problem is our gate is available. Our ramp area has been available for the past like 40 minutes, but air traffic control has us mixed in with American Airlines and Alaska and all the people that don't have gates available. But we're stuck in this traffic jam, and we keep passing these like intermediate turnoffs that we can use to get to our gate, right? And our primary concern, we don't mind, long taxis in, we're trying to get the passengers there. We get paid by the minute, but the problem is the long tarmac delay program per the DOT. We have 3 hours to get on the gate, both taking off and after we land. And we hit the 2 hour mark, and myself and probably about 3 other aircraft that were my company aircraft, fellow 737s and Airbuses, we can see our gate. It's like a football field away. It's 100 yards. It's wide open. It's right there. And we keep passing these intermediate intersections that we can take and get out of this line. And we tried asking. We said, hey, ground control, this is such and such. We are approaching 2 hours on the ground, and we just want to make you aware that we're going to be turning into long tarmac delay aircraft, and our gates have been open and available. Is there any chance we can get out of this line and just go? And they said, negative, just keep moving. And they kept shuffling us and keeping us jammed in this line, trying to move. And with other aircraft like American and Alaska, that didn't have gates, and all the other aircraft with from my company, we had gates available, and we were just trying to make it to the gate. So that was extremely frustrating. I know and I trust O'Hare. O'Hare is one of the greatest, or is the greatest airport with the greatest controllers, in my personal opinion. I've operated with them, for 10 years basically of my career. And I love them. I trust them. So I know there's a big picture thing that was going on that they were handling themselves. So I trusted them and trusted the process. But I was getting frustrated because it was like, I can see a quick way to get into the gate without what I assume would be um, affecting traffic flow. But we keep getting told no and basically stay in line. Which, it is what it, like I said, I just, when I got frustrated, I said, okay, O'Hare, they know what they're doing. I'm just gonna, and we've all said it. The five of us have said we're long tarmac delay aircraft. We need to get to a gate. So they are aware of it. So we eventually did make it, but that was a long flight. So that was a 3.5 hour Des Moines flight, which Des Moines is only like 40 minutes away from O'Hare flight time wise. So that gives you kind of an idea of how long that flight took. So we go overnight downtown. We come back up. The next night, we're supposed to be going to Nashville. It's just one leg, Chicago, Nashville. Of course, inbound airplane is delayed, and it's snowing. So, we're luckily we got de-ice and stuff at the actual gate. We do that on the non-American and non-Delta side. So, our company does it at the gate, which is really nice because that means we're pushed and ready to go. We're not clogging up any de-ice facility. And our holdover time was roughly about, I think, 3 hours or so in light snow. So we had more than enough time. Once again, slow taxi out because of all the taxiways were slick. And I don't know if it was the weather conditions causing them to be slick, but normally the O'Hare broom team, I post about them all the time on my TikTok, but they're my personal heroes because they're usually really, really good at keeping all the taxiways clear. This is the most treacherous I've ever seen the taxiways at O'Hare during a winter storm. But finally get out to the runway. We blast off, go down to Nashville. Nashville's starting to get rain and stuff. So it's an ILS to about 500 feet. We land, park, min rest overnight. So, minimum rest. So I get there. They call me with a new report time. Had to delay out the flight the next morning by 45 minutes to make sure we had our minimum rest. Get to the airport. Once again, we're flying in and out of winter weather. The weather that was affecting O'Hare is now affecting Nashville and Cleveland, which is where our turn was. We had 3 legs that day. So once again, briefed, hey, I'm going to do the flying. I'm going to do the hard work today. You can just sit back, relax, and work the radios for me because it's safer if I'm the one doing the landings and stuff like that. So we get into O'Hare. And once again, it's clear weather in O'Hare, but we are having a lot of issues with taxiways not being cleared. And there were a couple of taxiways which had nil braking. Nil means there is zero braking action, right? We call it nil. One of them was at the intersection of Gulf and Lima Lima, which is where we always cross from 28 right when we're coming into the terminal area. And I remember looking at it and going, I can't tell if that's snow or if that's treated, but it looks slick. So I told my first officer, I'm going to take it nice and slow. Like I am going ridiculously slow around these corners because I don't want to slip, right? And sure enough, I'm coming around that left turn. I'm going like 2 knots, right? Which is slower than a human being walking, right? Once again, my passengers could walk faster to the gate than I was taxiing because that's how slow I taxi in icy conditions. I always tell people I hate driving my 4-wheel drive pickup truck during icy conditions and when it's snowing outside on the road, let alone an 80-ton airplane like a 900 ER, which is what I was taxiing, which is one of the biggest, heaviest airplanes or 737 variants that I fly. So we're starting to come around that corner just a little bit, and I notice we stop turning left, right? Even though I still have my tiller in, I know the nose wheel is pointing left, we stop turning left. So that's my instant indication of, we're on ice, right? So I release the nose wheel, right? Because I don't want to scrub the nose wheel. I don't want it like sliding sideways across something. And then I go to hit the brakes, right? Because my thing is, okay, if we're sliding, I'm just going to hit the brakes and stop. Well, I hit the brakes. I have my full weight on the brakes. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I am pressing down on the brakes and we are still sliding. So I announced to my first officer, said, hey, we are sliding. Stand by, right? Because I'm trying to figure out what we're going to do. So I can't get any brakes. The back wheels, which are about like 100 to 120 feet behind me, the main wheels, hit that same ice now. So now the back end of this 130-foot long airplane is starting to slide. I can feel it sliding, which is the most unnerving thing I've ever experienced as a captain. Um, and the only thing I could think of was to pull out go into idle reverse thrust, right? Because I don't have any brakes. I don't have anything, right? The only thing I have are my engines. So as I'm doing this, I look over, and on the taxiway there is a 3 foot in diameter dry spot. I don't know why that one spot was clear, but clear of ice, clear of contamination. So in my head, I'm trying, with what limited steering I have with the tiller and rudder pedals, I am trying to direct our drift to that spot so I can at least get one main tire with my brakes into that spot. At the same time, I'm in idle reverse thrust to try to stop us from moving forward, right? Using the force of the air to stop because the brakes weren't working. And somehow, in that split second that I was like, hey, we're sliding, I was able to do all that and somehow guide that right wheel to that spot and was able to grab enough traction to stop the airplane. And then we immediately reported it to air traffic control. We said, hey, Lima Lima intersection Gulf Gulf, it is nil braking. We were sliding. And then I took it real slow and we got out of that area, but that was one of many areas that were like that. And we weren't the only ones that reported it. Another aircraft behind us, another 737, because that's where we switch over frequencies to ground control. Probably didn't hear us talk about it. Mentioned the same thing, said, hey, we were sliding and we almost didn't make it, meaning they almost went off the taxiway, which, I mean, at that point we can't do anything. We're sliding, right? So, luckily, I think they eventually went out and cleared it because when we came back later in the day, it was cleared, which is nice. But it took a lot of poking air traffic control and operations to be like, hey, you guys need to come clear this. It's unacceptable that you guys are taxiing us through these areas because normally O'Hare's on top of it. I've never seen it like this. So we took it really slow, going like 3 knots all the way to the gate, parked, ran to the next airplane because we had to do a Cleveland turn. Got out to Cleveland. Cleveland was experiencing the same winter weather, so we were landing in snow. Decent visibility. We got moderate icing coming through, about 6,000 feet, which is unusual. It's the most icing I've seen in a while. We landed, parked, turned, de-iced, and got out of there uneventfully. And by the time we landed back in Chicago, the taxiways were still iffy on certain ones, but overall, it was a better improvement. So got to the gate. Of course, my first commute option canceled. I'm banking on my second option. And then the third one ends up getting delayed until like 11 p.m. at night. So I'm like, I need to get on this Envoy flight home. Thank you, Envoy, for getting me home. Got home late, and now I only have 2 days off, and I'm turning around and commuting out early tomorrow, the day prior to my trip. So definitely a whirlwind adventure. It was a very stressful week. Winter operations is not stressful in itself. I don't mind de-icing. I don't mind landing in the snow. I don't mind taxiing around in low visibility weather. I did in Anchorage last week. But the problem is, it's just there was a lot going on this week with winter weather. Runways were great. Taxiways were iffy in terms of braking action. Also having the RJ go off in Des Moines. Countless delays, multiple schedule changes. For me, it was a rough week. So I've been trying to do my best here at home to try to reset, rewind, because I got to go back and do it again, starting on Saturday. So that's going to be kind of the next adventure and what you'll probably hear about next week. Let's move on to our discussion topic for the day. It was supposed to be discussion because Tommy did have some good questions involving de-icing and anti-icing and stuff like that while I was on the trip that I wasn't really able to answer, but I wanted to answer here. But it's going to be more of a Bill's Corner. I'm just going to kind of talk you through, especially if you're a new passenger or have never experienced winter flying before, what you can expect. So the first and foremost things you can expect, delays, unfortunately. Delays are a side effect of winter weather flying, especially severe winter weather like we had this past week in O'Hare and in the Midwest. Now, the taxi times and stuff are actually padded during the winter. That arrival time and flight time that you have on your ticket on the app actually includes the extra time to de-ice and slowly taxi to the gate. Where the delays really come in are when air traffic control puts on ground delay programs like ground stops in O'Hare, where they stop all traffic flying in because they have to do important stuff like clear the runways, clear the taxiways, etc., to make it safe for aircraft landing. So it's a necessary inconvenience for safety reasons is the best way to put it. So number one, expect delays. If you expect delays, you won't be surprised when they happened. Go on an earlier flight if you can, especially if you're trying to make that cruise in the Caribbean to get away from the winter weather. Don't fly in the day of the cruise. Go in maybe 2 days before, or consider driving if the weather's safe for you to drive to wherever you're going for your cruise. My 2 cents as a avid cruiser myself. Um, Now let's talk about what you can expect when you get on the actual airplane. So everything for you all is going to be pretty much normal. You're going to push off the gate. You're going to start the engines. And depending on where you are, you may get de-iced right off the gate. You may get de-iced on the gate where you don't even know you're getting de-iced, and then we're just going to push off and go like we did in Chicago. Or like in Cleveland, you go to a specific de-ice facility like a pad, and then you get de-iced there. So some things that people don't realize about de-icing is, one, it is loud. When that fluid hits the fuselage and the wings, you can hear it. So be prepared for that. It's kind of startling if you don't anticipate it. But two, a big thing too is be prepared for the cabin to get stuffy. So during de-icing, or before de-icing, I should say, we will configure the aircraft in order to make it safe to de-ice. And what that means is we'll turn off the bleed air from the engines and the APU, our little auxiliary power unit. And that's to keep the fluid from being ingested into the engines and then the fumes being ingested into the cabin. That's for your safety. But the unfortunate downside of that is that the cabin does get stuffy because we're turning off the air conditioning. So just be prepared for that. Now, depending on also where you're taxiing to, like O'Hare, the central de-ice facility, it can take a long time to de-ice, depending on the line. But like in Cleveland, it only took us 20 minutes once we were parked. So the first process you'll see is what we call de-icing. De-icing, which is type 1 fluid. Type 1 fluid is a chemical mixture that is specific and heated to remove existing ice that built up on the aircraft, either while it was sitting on the ground or, like in our case in Cleveland, when we flew in. In our case, we kept the flaps down because we picked up ice and we don't want to retract the flaps too far after landing. We bring them up about halfway to prevent any sort of damage with ice inside the track fairings and the actual like lift mechanisms for the flaps. So when we first get out to the ice pad, we'll sit there for a second, reconfigure. And then we'll give them the okay to put on that type 1 de-icing fluid, which once again is to primarily remove ice that currently exists or snow that currently exists on the aircraft. So that fluid is orange. So you'll see that. Some people, like in O'Hare, they'll do like the aft fuselage and mainly the wings and tail. Other, like in Cleveland, they do full body type 1, which is fine. But most aircraft and most programs do type 1 full body. Now, once that is done, there'll be a momentary pause. You'll see the liquid, the orange liquid, stop for a second, and it's not very, I guess, viscous. It flows pretty. It just looks like fluid. It's like water. You won't know the difference. Now, once that's done, they'll pause for a second, and you'll notice the flaps will start coming up on the aircraft. Okay, the flaps will start coming up because now that we're de-iced, it's safe for us to retract the flaps. And when the flaps are out and they're sloped, the next step, which is anti-icing fluid type 4, we don't want it sliding off the wing. When the flaps are extended with type 4, it actually reduces the efficiency or the holdover time, the safe time for the aircraft to take off by 24%. So we taxi around with the flaps up to help keep the fluid on the wings, okay? So once we're reconfigured, we'll tell the de-ice team, hey, we're cleared for type 4 wings and tail. On the 145 and some smaller aircraft with the tail-mounted engines, we actually had to do full-body Type 4 from just behind the main cabin door to just in front of the engine inlets on top of the fuselage, and that's to prevent any slush or anything that was up there falling off and hitting or going into the engines and causing a flame out on the engines or damage to the engines like chunk of ice during takeoff. That's only on the smaller jets. Usually the bigger jets with the engines underneath the wings, it's considered wings and tail only. And that's what it is on the 737. So you'll notice that now they're going to be spraying this green. It's green fluid, and it's almost chunky. It's kind of like it's thicker. It's almost like a Jello consistency, and they're spraying that all over the wings. And that is what's called Type 4 anti-icing fluid. De-icing removes ice from the aircraft. Anti-icing Type 4 fluid prevents icing and snow and contaminants from adhering to the wing while we're taxiing out. Okay, so you'll see this nice clear liquid sitting on top of the wing, and what that does is when the snow hits it, it absorbs it and dissolves it so it doesn't stick to the wing. Okay, so once that's done, we'll reconfigure the airplane. The flaps will remain up because I know I've had a couple of pilots that weren't, I guess, airline pilots come up and said that they were worried because we were taxiing out without our flaps, which is a valid concern, right? If you're a pilot or know anything about aviation, you look outside, like, why are we going to the runway without flaps? Why aren't the flaps down? It's part of it. We're protecting that holdover time. It's the amount of time that the FAA deems safe for us to take off where that fluid is effective. Perfect example of where the accident that caused this was back in the 1980s out of Stapleton, Denver. It was Continental 1713, where they exceeded that holdover time and that fluid was no longer acceptable. Okay. Because what happens on takeoff is that fluid at about 180-ish knots is designed to fall off the wing. It's designed to shear, and you'll see it come off the wing at that airspeed and take all the contaminants with us. So by the time we're taking off, we have a very clean wing with no contamination, snow, or frost on the wing. Okay, so that's the whole point of Type 4. So that's why we keep the flaps up, is we're protecting the wing as much as we can. So when we taxi out, you can see the flaps up. Another thing that commonly startles passengers and even sometimes flight attendants is with the airplanes, at least on the 737, and I think every fleet at my company, we have to do what's called a run-up. So we have to push the thrust up to, depending on the airplane, if it's a max, it's 50%. For a NG or like the non-max air 737s, it's push it up to 70% for 30 seconds. And what that does is it's twofold. It clears any sort of fluid that's still in the engine, the de-icing fluid, out. So that way when we turn on the bleeds and turn on the air conditioning again, it's not going to go into the cabin. But what that also does is they don't directly de-ice the engines because they're not, well, unless we ask them to, but they're not supposed to spray directly in there. So it prevents and it slings off any ice buildup that's been on the fan blades or the spinners, the little cone that's in front of the engine blades in the engine. And we'll do that once every 30 minutes for the non-max aircraft, and for the max aircraft, it's every 60 minutes. But we will do that. So it is starred link because you're slowly taxiing on the runway, and then suddenly you hear the engines run up, and you're not anywhere near the runway, especially if the flaps are not up or not in takeoff position. You're going, whoa, what's going on? That's what's happening. We are running up the engines. Now, when we get a little bit closer to the runway, you'll see the flaps coming down. So when departure is imminent and within, I always do it basically, if I taxi at my current airspeed or at my current ground speed, and they give us clearance for takeoff, and we just do a continuous roll on the runway, I want the flaps down and the checklist done prior to reaching the hold short line before entering the runway environment. That's how I time my flaps. It's not like a certain time period before, etc. Because if I have a line of 20 airplanes in front of me, then that's going to vary. So as we're nearing the runway, you'll hear the flaps go down. Usually the first officer will make the flight attendants prepare for departure, PA, and etc. Just like normal. Then when we get on the runway on the 737, especially in active icing conditions, like it was in Cleveland and in O'Hare, Nashville, when we were going to Nashville, you will feel us, once again, push the thrust up to about 70% in one, which is loud. And we will sit there for 30 seconds, which is recommended in order to sling any ice and to verify stable operation before we continue the takeoff roll. The only caveat to that, especially and even on the run-up too, on the taxi out, is if we start slipping and sliding, we're told per our manual to release the brakes and just go. Same thing with the taxi out run-up. It says 70%, but like in Des Moines, I couldn't get to 70% without slipping and sliding, so I had to keep the thrust at the highest I could without slipping and sliding, which was about 50% in one for 30 seconds. But you can expect 70% thrust for 30 seconds. So you're going to sit there for a while, not moving on the runway. We're not moving. We're just doing a static run up. So don't get nervous. Don't get scared. That's normal. And then when it's time to go, we'll smoothly release the brakes and continue to set our takeoff thrust, which is an additional 15%, and then take off. Same thing coming in after landing in icing conditions. If we are assuming that we picked up ice on the flaps, which is usually indicated by icing everywhere else on the airplane, then we will only bring them up to 15 degrees, which is about half of the full length, but it's not fully up. So you will see a lot of times during winter weather operations, airplanes taxi around with their flaps out into the gate or flaps down. That is completely normal. A lot of people assume, hey, you forgot your flaps. Not that. Rampers have asked that. Gate agents are like, is there something wrong with the airplane? It's not. It's just normal operating procedures for us. And it's ultimately up to the captain what we do. And I tend to be a little more conservative because I don't want to break the flaps. So if I am flying through icing conditions with the flaps extended, so I have visible indication of ice on my indicators, which is the windshield components, like the windshield wiper components, then I'll just say leave them down. Or if we land on a contaminated runway, once again has clutter. So like it has snow, slush, ice, then we'll just keep them down because that a lot of times that'll get kicked up and caked onto the flaps, so we don't want to retract them. Conversely, you also want to, it's kind of like an O'Hare, the runways were extremely clean. So as we were clearing the runway, it was extremely important that we got the flaps up before we started onto the taxiways that were contaminated versus the runways, because the runways weren't contaminated and we weren't picking up ice on the flight in. It was just the taxiway, so we had to make sure we pulled up the flaps quick enough, and I took it nice and slow so the flaps are up before we started taxiing through the slush. So that, in a nutshell, is winter operations for Part 121 operations here, which is airline operations here in the United States. So I hope that was able to help some of you, because I know I get a lot of nervous flyers asking questions about it, like what was that run up? Why were we taxiing around without flaps? So that way you have a framework of what to expect when you are flying in the winter weather. And once again, weather, I hate to say it, but expect delays. It's a necessary inconvenience because the delays usually help with traffic flow, clearing the runways and taxiways to allow safer operations in and out of the United States major airports. So with that, folks, I'm going to conclude episode number 43, Captain Jack Frost. You can follow me on TikTok at Captain Bill Official. This is live on Torque and Thrust, which is our specific TikTok for the Torque and Thrust Talk Show. All I got to type in is Torque and Thrust Talk Show. It should pop up. So if you follow me, definitely go follow that as well, because that's where we're going to be going live from now on. And you can also follow me on the purple and red channels as well, under the same name, Captain Bill Official, and also Torque and Thrust Talk Shows on there as well if you want to get live notifications when we go live. The next episode should be a week from today, December 11th at the same time, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, hopefully with Tommy D next time. But until then, everyone be safe, stay warm, stay safe in this winter weather, especially my pilots out there. Continue to be safe, operate safely, and remember, when in doubt, don't find out. Just take everything slow. It's not worth your career or the safety of your aircraft or passengers to risk anything. So please continue to be safe out there, and I will see you all next time on the Torque and Thrust Talk Show.
In the sky, the engines roar. On the ground, the wheels explore. From the cockpit to the open road, stories of the brave unfold.